At 1007 on the morning of June 19, 1944, a fighter direction officer sat in the darkened Combat Information Center aboard the USS Lexington, watching green phosphorescent blips crawl across his radar screen 130 miles west of his position. 69 Japanese aircraft were heading straight toward Task Force 58. The radar screen showed everything: the Japanese formation, the American carriers, and between them, empty ocean. In the next 12 minutes, fighter directors across the task force would have to coordinate the interception of those 69 enemy aircraft using dozens of Grumman F6F Hellcat fighters scattered across 3 different altitudes and separated by miles of banked Philippine Sea. The Americans had something the Japanese didn't know existed: a technological advantage so complete that what happened in the next 17 minutes would change naval warfare forever. Japanese pilots launched from 9 carriers that morning, believing they were flying conventional strike missions against the American fleet. Vice Admiral Hisaburo Ozawa's first wave consisted of 69 aircraft, a mix of Mitsubishi A6MO fighters, Yokosuka D-4Y dive bombers, and Nakajima B-6N torpedo planes. The plan was simple: fly to the American carriers, attack from altitude, sink as many as possible. The Americans had 15 carriers. Japan needed to destroy at least 5 to shift the balance. Japanese pilots knew American aircraft were tough, and American pilots were skilled, but they believed they would see American fighters coming. They were wrong. At that exact moment, every movement their formation made was being tracked by an SK-2 air search radar aboard the battleship Alabama, detected at 150 miles range, plotted on transparent vertical boards in multiple combat information centers across the task force, and analyzed by teams of radar operators, plotters, and fighter directors who were preparing to vector American fighters to intercept the formation before it came anywhere near the carriers. Earlier that morning, at 0745, a moment of heroism had bought the Japanese fleet temporary reprieve. As the carrier Taiho launched her second wave, USS Albacore fired 6 torpedoes at the flagship. Warrant Officer Sakio Komatsu, a strike pilot who had just taken off in his Yokosuka D-4Y dive bomber, saw the torpedo wake streaking toward his carrier. He broke formation, dove his aircraft into the path of one torpedo, and deliberately crashed into it. The torpedo detonated. Komatsu died instantly. His sacrifice destroyed 1 torpedo, but 5 others continued toward Taiho. 4 missed. The 6th struck the carrier's starboard side, rupturing aviation fuel tanks and jamming the forward elevator. Damage seemed minor. Taiho continued launching aircraft, but ruptured fuel lines were filling the ship with explosive vapors. The carrier was a bomb waiting to detonate. Komatsu's heroism had delayed the inevitable by hours, not prevented it. The first major test of American radar-directed fighter defense had come on June 11, 1944. Task Force 58 launched a massive strike against Saipan. 208 fighters and 8 torpedo bombers hit Japanese positions across the island. American pilots claimed 86 kills in the air, plus 33 aircraft destroyed on the ground. Japanese pilots trying to intercept the strike found American Hellcats waiting at precise altitudes and headings. Not by chance, not by luck, by radar detection and coordinated vector assignments from combat information centers aboard multiple carriers. Japanese pilots reported that American fighters appeared from nowhere, perfectly positioned. Their commanders assumed it was coincidence. They were wrong. The Americans were tracking every Japanese aircraft from the moment it took off. 4 days later, on June 15 at dusk, Japanese forces launched a probe against Task Force 58. 7 torpedo aircraft attacked from Guam. American radar detected them at 80 miles range. Fighter directors vetoed Hellcats to intercept. 6 of the 7 Japanese aircraft were shot down before reaching the carriers. The 7th turned back. 0 hits on American ships. The Japanese pilots who survived reported that American Combat Air Patrol seemed to know exactly where they were coming from and at what altitude. Japanese intelligence couldn't explain it. Reconnaissance had reported no American fighters in the interception area. The Hellcats had simply materialized, perfectly positioned. What the Japanese didn't understand was that they were no longer fighting individual pilots. They were fighting a system. By mid-June 1944, the Combat Information Center had become the nerve center of American carrier operations. The concept had evolved from hard lessons learned in 1942. At the Battle of Midway, American carriers had fought almost blind. Radar existed but remained primitive. Communication between ships was chaotic. Fighter direction happened by guesswork and visual sighting. Carriers burned because the defensive system couldn't position fighters effectively. After Midway, the Navy knew it needed something better. Admiral Chester Nimitz's staff studied the problem. They examined British experiences with radar-directed fighter control. They analyzed radio communication failures. They designed new procedures. In November 1942, the Pacific Fleet issued Tactical Bulletin for TB-42, establishing standardized fighter direction procedures. In January 1943, Admiral Ernest King formally renamed the Coordination Center the Combat Information Center. By early 1944, every new carrier had a dedicated CIC space with trained operators. The system worked through integration. Multiple ships equipped with SK-2 air search radars detected incoming raids at ranges up to 150 miles. The radar returns appeared on circular scopes with rotating sweep lines. Operators called out range and bearing. Enlisted plotters marked the contacts on large transparent vertical plotting boards using grease pencils. Different colors for different raid types. Numbers assigned to each group. Raid 1, Raid 2, Raid 3. The plots showed everything. Enemy aircraft, friendly fighters, surface ships. All on one display, visible to everyone in the CIC. The fighter direction officer stood behind the plotters, watching the entire tactical picture develop in real time. He had radio communication with every Hellcat in the air. VHF radio, clear live, multiple frequencies to prevent interference. He could see the fighters on the plot. He could see the incoming raid. He could calculate intercept courses, altitudes, and timing. Then he would pick up the radio microphone and vector the fighters into position. Turn left heading 270. Climbed Angels 18. Bogey bearing 295. Range 60 miles. The fighters would acknowledge and maneuver. The plot would update. The intercept would develop and the Japanese would fly straight into a carefully positioned trap without ever knowing it existed. The problem wasn't that Japanese pilots didn't know what to do. They knew. Japanese naval aviation doctrine emphasized attacking from altitude using speed, coordinating strikes. The doctrine was sound. The tactics had worked for 2 years. But doctrine assumed both sides were fighting blind. Doctrine assumed you could approach undetected until visual range. Doctrine assumed enemy combat air patrol would be randomly positioned. All those assumptions had been true in 1942 at Coral Sea, at Midway, at Santa Cruz. Japanese formations had approached American carriers and fought their way through combat air patrols positioned by guesswork. Sometimes the Japanese got through. Sometimes they didn't, but they always had a chance. By June 1944, those assumptions were obsolete. The Americans weren't guessing anymore. They were tracking, they were calculating, they were vectoring, and Japanese pilots were flying into precisely coordinated interceptions without understanding why. On the morning of June 19th, the Japanese mobile fleet under Vice Admiral Hisaburo Ozawa launched 4 massive strikes against Task Force 58. Ozawa commanded 9 aircraft carriers, 430 carrier aircraft. He expected support from 300 land-based aircraft operating from Guam, Rotor, and Tinian. He believed he had numerical advantage. He believed his aircraft had superior range, allowing him to strike from 200 meters out, while American carriers could only launch from 150 miles. He believed he could attack the Americans, land on Guam to refuel and rearm, then shuttle back to his carriers. He believed the Americans would be forced to defend against attacks from multiple directions simultaneously, overwhelming their defenses. What Ozawa didn't know was that American submarines had already spotted his fleet. USS Flying Fish detected his carriers on June 15. USS Seahorse spotted his battleships the same day. USS Kavala tracked the fleet on June 17 and 18. American intelligence had broken Japanese operational codes. Admiral Raymond Spruant, commanding the Fifth Fleet, knew Ozawa was coming. Admiral Marc Mitscher, commanding Task Force 58 from the Lexington, prepared a coordinated defense that would destroy Japanese naval aviation in a single day. At 0700 hours on June 19, American radar operators detected Japanese aircraft forming up over Guam. At 0800 hours, a large formation was detected 80 miles southwest of the task force. At 1000 hours, the first major raid appeared on radar screens across the fleet. 69 aircraft, range 150 miles, bearing west, altitude unknown, but probably high, closing at 180 knots. Fighter directors designated it Raid 1. The task force fighter director aboard the Lexington coordinated with task group fighter directors across the fleet. Multiple carriers prepared to launch every available fighter. The system that had been developed over 2 years, refined through combat experience, and perfected through training, was about to face its greatest test. The fighter direction officer in the Lexington CIC watched the plot develop. The Japanese formation appeared as a cluster of grease pencil marks. Moving steadily east, the Hellcats were already airborne on routine combat air patrol, with more launching from every carrier in the task force. Fighter directors needed them positioned 70 miles west at 18,000 feet perfect altitude to intercept the Japanese before they could begin their attack dive. But the Hellcats were scattered across 40 miles of ocean at varying altitudes. Radio calls snapped through the air. Stand by. To 5. Turn right, heading 280. Climbed Angels 18. Stand by. 18. Maintain head, Angels 20. Stand by. 3-4. Come left. To 6-5. On the plot, the Hellcats began to converge 60 miles out. 55. 50. Meanwhile, the Japanese raid continued closing, 100 miles. 90. 80. The intercept was forming. Timing was tight, but possible. But doctrine assumed the enemy was blind. The Hellcats hit them 60 miles out. 70 Japanese aircraft destroyed before the raid reached the American task force. The remainder scattered. 4 attacked the carriers. Near misses. Knowing hits. All 4 shot down. The second raid had been annihilated with even greater efficiency than the first. The third raid came at 1,300 hours. 47 aircraft from the north. Same pattern. Detection, plotting, vectors, intercept. 7 Japanese aircraft shot down in the initial contact. The rest turned back without pressing the attack. Japanese pilots were beginning to understand they were flying into a trap they couldn't see and couldn't counter. But they had no way to communicate the nature of that trap to commanders who didn't understand radar-directed fighter control. The fourth raid launched between 1,000 and 1,130 82 aircraft. This formation couldn't locate the American fleet. They circled, searched, burned fuel. Navigation errors compounded by combat stress. Eventually, they headed for Guam to land and refuel. Fighter directors detected them on radar heading toward a roadie field. Hellcats from the light carrier Cowpens were vetoed to intercept over Guam. 12 Hellcats from Cowpens joined, 7 from Essex, and 8 from Hornet. 27 American fighters total. They arrived over a roadie field as the Japanese were circling to land. Fuel low, defenses down, completely vulnerable. The American fighters tore into them. 30 Japanese aircraft shot down over the field. 19 landed but were damaged by strafing runs. 0 effective aircraft remaining from that raid. By 1,600 hours, the battle was over. Japanese losses for June 19 exceeded 346 carrier aircraft destroyed. American losses were 30 aircraft. The statistical disparity was unprecedented. Japanese naval aviation had suffered a defeat so complete that it would never recover. The carrier force that had attacked Pearl Harbor that had terrorized the Pacific for 2 years, was effectively finished. Not because American pilots were better trained, though they were. Not because American aircraft were superior, though they were. But because the Americans had built a system that integrated radar detection, coordinated communication, and precise fighter direction into a seamless defensive network that Japanese pilots couldn't penetrate, and Japanese commanders couldn't understand. The statistics told the story, but the statistics didn't capture what had actually happened. Japanese pilots had launched that morning, believing they were attacking an enemy who fought the same way they did. Visual sight, a visual initiative. Pilot skill against pilot skill. Instead, they had encountered something completely different. A coordinated defense system that saw them coming from 150 miles away, calculated their course and altitude with mathematical precision, positioned interceptors perfectly, and destroyed them in carefully orchestrated engagements that left no room for individual skill to compensate. It wasn't a fair fight. It was systematic execution. What the Japanese pilots didn't see was the Combat Information Center. They didn't see the radar operators watching green blips on circular screens. They didn't see the enlisted plotters marking transparent boards with grease pencils. They didn't see the fighter directors with radio microphones issuing comm vectors to Hellcat pilots. They didn't see teams of sailors working together with rehearsed precision. They only saw the result. Hellcats appearing from perfect positions every single time, no matter how they maneuvered, no matter how they approached. The Americans were always ready, always positioned, always waiting. Japanese pilots reported this to their commanders. The Americans must have new radar. The Americans must have broken our codes. The Americans must have spies on our carriers. The reports were partially correct. The Americans did have excellent radar. They had broken Japanese codes. But those weren't the decisive factors. The decisive factor was integration. The Americans had taken detection technology, communication systems, plotting techniques, and fighter direction doctrine and integrated them into a coordinated system that functioned as a single weapon. The Japanese had most of the same components. They had radar, Type 2 air search radar with 50 miles range, and 5D re-bearing error. They had radio communication. They had skilled pilots and experienced commanders. What they lacked was integration. Japanese carriers operated independently. Each ship tracked its own radar contacts and directed its own fighters. There was no unified picture, no coordinated vectors, no systematic approach. Japanese fighter direction remained intuitive and individual rather than systematic and coordinated. By the time Japanese engineers understood what the Americans had built, it was too late to respond. The industrial capacity to develop a comparable system didn't exist. The trained personnel to operate it were dead. The time to implement it had run out. Japan was losing the war. The Combat Information Center concept had been developed through institutional effort across the United States Navy. After the Battle of Midway exposed critical weaknesses in carrier defense, multiple officers and technical experts worked to solve the problem. Radar specialists improved detection capabilities. Communications officers developed better radio procedures. Tactical experts designed fighter direction doctrine. Training officers created standardized operating procedures. The system emerged from collaboration among dozens of contributors, each solving part of the puzzle. No single person invented the CIC. It was engineered through systematic analysis of combat failures and methodical development of solutions. Lieutenant Commander John Monsarrat was one of the first fighter direction officers trained in the new system. He served aboard the light carrier Langley during the Battle of the Philippine Sea. In the Langley CIC, Monsarrat coordinated fighter intercepts against Japanese raids throughout June 19th. His experience that day and his observations of how the system performed under combat stress informed his later work documenting CIC procedures. After the war, Monsarrat wrote technical papers and a memoir describing the evolution of radar-directed fighter control. His 1985 book, Angel on the Yardarm, provided detailed accounts of how CIC operations functioned during the Philippine Sea battle. Monsarrat made clear in his writing that the system's success came from teamwork among radar operators, plotters, and fighter directors working together with rehearsed precision. Individual skill mattered, but the system was what made that skill effective. The fighter directors who vetoed the intercepts on June 19th never received individual recognition. No medals, no commendations, no names in official reports. The citation for Task Force 58 mentioned radar-directed fighter interception as a key factor in the victory, but it credited the system, not individuals. The Navy wanted to keep the capability secret. At 10:23, Admiral Mitscher ordered maximum fighter launch from all carriers. Every available Hellcat went into the air, over 200 fighters. The sky filled with American aircraft, all coordinated, all vectored, all positioned by the fighter directors watching radar plots. More radio calls. The Japanese formation reached 70 miles. The lead Hellcat division reported visual contact. Bandits high, 12 o'clock. Large formation. The fighter director issued the command, tally ho, execute. The Hellcats dove. The lead division struck the Japanese formation from above and ahead, perfect position. The Japanese never saw them until the Hellcats were already in their midst. Zeros tried to turn and engage, but it was too late. The Hellcats had punched through the formation, scattering it. More divisions arrived from other vectors, precisely where fighter directors had placed them. The Japanese formation disintegrated. Isolated aircraft tried to push toward the carriers. Hellcats hunted them down one by one. Anti-aircraft fire from screening battleships and cruisers formed a wall of explosions at 12,000 feet. Any Japanese aircraft that slipped past the fighters flew straight into that barrier. Very few survived. By 10:40, the engagement was over. 42 of 69 Japanese aircraft were destroyed. 27 turned back or scattered. 0 hits on American carriers. 1 Hellcat was shot down, the pilot rescued by a destroyer. At T-1107, radar detected Raid 2, 109 aircraft, larger than the first, approaching from the northwest at a range of 120 miles. The task force fighter director immediately assigned intercepts to multiple carriers. Essex took primary responsibility. Lexington supported. Bunker Hill launched additional fighters. The system repeated. Radar detection, plotting, vector assignment, intercept coordination. The Hellcats from Raid 1 were still airborne. They reformed and repositioned new vectors, new altitude, new heading, new intercept point. Raid 2 advanced steadily. The Japanese formation held course without evasive maneuvers, maintaining strict formation discipline as doctrine dictated. Fighter directors continued their work without public recognition, training new operators, refining procedures, improving coordination. The war continued for 14 more months. Every carrier battle that followed used the same system. The Philippines campaign, Uema, Okinawa. Every time American radar detected Japanese formations, combat information centers plotted them. Fighter directors vetoed Hellcats to intercept. The pattern repeated. The results were consistent. Japanese aircraft destroyed. American carriers protected. The superiority was absolute. The Japanese never developed an equivalent integrated system. They had the technology. They had intelligent engineers. They had combat experience. That should have revealed the problem. Organizational culture and institutional inertia prevented adaptation. Japanese doctrine emphasized individual initiative and fighting spirit. The idea of systematic coordination through centralized direction contradicted cultural values about warrior independence. Even when Japanese officers recognized the American advantage, they couldn't implement similar systems because the institutional structure to support them didn't exist. By the time some Japanese commanders understood what needed to change, Japan's carrier force had been destroyed, and the industrial base to build new systems had been bombed to rubble. The Battle of the Philippine Sea demonstrated conclusively that modern warfare had entered a new era. Technology alone didn't determine victory. The British had radar before the Americans. The Germans had excellent radio communication. The Japanese had skilled pilots and combat experience. What mattered was integration. the ability to combine multiple technologies and procedures into a coordinated system, the willingness to train personnel systematically rather than relying on individual brilliance, the institutional discipline to follow procedures under stress rather than improvising. These factors, more than any individual weapon or tactic, determined the outcome. After the war, the Combat Information Center concept became standard on every American warship. The procedures developed in 1942 through 1944 evolved into modern naval air defense networks. When the Navy developed the Aegis combat system in the 1970s and 82nd, it built on the same foundational principles established during World War II. Radar detection, computer plotting, coordinated weapon assignment, systematic engagement. The technology advanced dramatically. Computers replaced grease pencils. Digital displays replaced transparent boards. But the underlying concept remained identical. Integrate detection, coordination, and execution into a seamless system. In 1958, a technical paper on naval air defense history noted that the success of the Combat Information Center proved that modern warfare required integration of detection, communication, and coordination capabilities. Individual skill still mattered. Brave pilots, skilled radar operators, and experienced commanders all contributed to victory. But without the system to position those individuals effectively, skill alone wasn't enough. The side with better information and better coordination would always defeat the side with superior individual warriors fighting independently. The Battle of the Philippine Sea proved that principle. 69 Japanese aircraft in the first raid. 42 destroyed. 109 Japanese aircraft in the second raid. 70 destroyed. The mathematics were brutal. The Japanese were brave. They were skilled. They were experienced. But they were fighting a system they couldn't see and couldn't counter, and the other system destroyed them. The photograph exists in the Naval History and Heritage Command archives, taken inside the Combat Information Center of a carrier during operations off Saipan in June 1944. It shows several officers standing around a large transparent plotting board, grease pencil marks visible on the glass, radar scopes glowing in the background. The officers are studying the plot with intense concentration. No names are visible in the caption, just the location and date. USS Carrier, Combat Information Center, June 1944. Those nameless officers working with nameless radar operators and nameless plotters helped destroy Japanese naval aviation in a single day. Not through individual heroics, not through dramatic last stands, through systematic coordination, through practiced procedures, through integration of technology and doctrine into a weapon the enemy couldn't match. That's how innovation actually happens in war. Not through brilliant individuals working alone, but through institutions that identify problems, develop solutions, train personnel, and refine procedures through experience. The radar didn't invent itself. The plotting boards weren't designed by accident. The fighter direction doctrine didn't emerge spontaneously. Hundreds of people across multiple organizations spent years developing every piece of the system. Engineers designed better radars. Communications specialists developed reliable radio procedures. Tactical experts analyzed combat data and revised doctrine. Training officers created schools to teach new techniques. Maintenance crews kept equipment functioning under harsh conditions. Supply officers ensured spare parts reached forward areas. And on June 19, 1944, all those separate efforts came together in the Combat Information Centers of Task Force 58 and proved that systematic integration could defeat individual skill, no matter how brave or experienced the individual warriors might be. The Japanese learned this lesson too late. Vice Admiral Ozawa survived the battle. He commanded what remained of the Japanese carrier force through the rest of 1944. At the Battle of Later Gulf in October, he used his remaining carriers as decoys to lure American forces away from invasion beaches. The carriers had almost no aircraft, almost no experienced pilots. They were hollow shells serving as bait. American carriers destroyed them easily. Ozawa survived again. After the war, American interrogators asked him about the Battle of the Philippine Sea. What had gone wrong? Why had Japanese naval aviation collapsed so completely? Ozawa said the Americans had better aircraft and better trained pilots. That was true, but incomplete. The Americans also had a system, and Ozawa, for all his experience and tactical skill, had never understood how to fight against systematic coordination. His pilots had flown bravely. His plan had been sound according to Japanese doctrine, but doctrine written for individual combat in 1941 couldn't work against integrated system warfare in 1944. The gap was unbridgeable. Japanese pilots flew into that gap on the morning of June 19th, believing they were flying normal strike missions, attack the Americans, sink some carriers, return to base. Some would die. That was expected, but most would survive. That was the normal ratio. Instead, 42 died from the first raid alone. 27 fled. 0 survived to reach the American carriers and deliver attacks. The Japanese had courage. They had training. They had skill. What they didn't have was a system that could compete with American radar-directed fighter control. Warrant Officer Sakio Komatsu had already died that morning, sacrificing himself to stop a torpedo from hitting Taiho. His heroism represented the best of Japanese warrior spirit. But individual heroism, no matter how extraordinary, couldn't overcome systematic technological superiority. And on June 19, 1944, that deficiency cost Japan 346 aircraft and the war in the Pacific. That's the hardest lesson of modern warfare. Courage doesn't matter if you're fighting the wrong kind of fight. Training doesn't matter if your doctrine is obsolete. Skill doesn't matter if the enemy can see you coming and position forces to counter your every move. The Japanese had courage. They had training. They had skill. What they didn't have was a system that could compete with American radar-directed fighter control. And on June 19, 1944, that deficiency cost them 346 aircraft and the war in the Pacific. The submarine war that morning had already dealt devastating blows to Ozawa's fleet. At 0816, USS Albacore fired a spread of 6 torpedoes at the carrier Taiho. Warrant Officer Sakio Komatsu, who had just taken off, saw the torpedo wakes and deliberately crashed his aircraft into one torpedo's path, destroying it at the cost of his life. 4 other torpedoes missed, but the 6th torpedo struck Taiho on the starboard side. The damage seemed minor. Aviation fuel vapor began leaking from ruptured tanks into the hangar deck. A damage control officer ordered the ventilation system turned to maximum to clear the fumes. The decision was fatally wrong. Instead of venting the vapors overboard, the ventilation system spread them throughout the ship. At 3:28 that afternoon, a spark ignited the vapor. Taiho exploded from within. Secondary explosions ripped through the ship. The carrier that had seemed undamaged that morning became an inferno in minutes. She sank at 428 with 1,650 crew members. 1,500 men died. At 11:118, USS Kavala fired torpedoes at the carrier Shokaku. 3 torpedoes struck the veteran carrier. Shokaku had participated in the Pearl Harbor attack. She had fought at Coral Sea, Santa Cruz, and a dozen other battles. She had survived bombs and torpedoes before, but this time, the damage was catastrophic. Aviation fuel fires spread rapidly. Damage control couldn't contain them. At 12:10, the captain ordered abandon ship. At 1504, Shokaku exploded and sank. 887 crew members died. The carrier that had terrorized the Pacific for 2 years vanished beneath the waves in the same battle where American fighters destroyed her aircraft. The loss of 2 fleet carriers compounded the disaster of losing 346 aircraft. But the human cost was even more devastating. Japan had started the war with approximately 3,500 highly trained carrier pilots. By June 1944, fewer than 1,000 experienced pilots remained. The training program couldn't replace losses, fuel shortages, limited flight training. New pilots received 3 months of instruction where pre-war pilots had trained for 2 years. The quality gap was enormous. Experienced American pilots shot down inexperienced Japanese pilots with terrible efficiency. The Battle of the Philippine Sea destroyed what remained of Japan's experienced pilot corps. After June 19th, Japanese carriers could barely man their remaining aircraft. Quality had collapsed along with quantity. The American victory came at minimal cost. 30 aircraft lost on June 19th. Most pilots recovered by rescue operations. Task Force 58 suffered no damage to carriers. The screening battleships and cruisers took no hits. The anti-aircraft defenses functioned perfectly. The proximity-fused shells, a top-secret American weapon, detonated near aircraft rather than requiring direct hits. Japanese pilots flew into walls of exploding shells that tracked them through the sky. The combination of radar-directed fighters and proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire created a defense the Japanese couldn't penetrate. On June 20th, American forces went on the offensive. Admiral Mitscher launched strikes against the retreating Japanese fleet. American pilots found Ozawa's carriers late in the afternoon, long range, near the limit of Hellcat operational radius. Pilots would have to fly back in darkness with minimal fuel reserves. Mitscher approved the strike anyway. American aircraft attacked the Japanese fleet at sunset. They damaged several carriers and sank the fleet oiler Gino Maru, but the strike's timing forced American pilots to return in darkness. Many ran out of fuel, ditched at sea. Some crashed attempting night landings on carriers. The losses that night exceeded the losses from Japanese action on June 19th. Mitscher made a controversial decision. He ordered every ship in the task force to turn on its lights, navigation lights, search lights, signal lamps, anything to guide pilots home. The illumination made Task Force 58 visible for miles. Japanese submarines could have attacked, but Mitscher believed saving pilots mattered more than maintaining blackout discipline. Most pilots found carriers and landed safely. Rescue operations continued through the night. American destroyer crews plucked dozens of aviators from the water. The final count showed 20 American aircraft lost in combat on June 20th. 80 lost to fuel exhaustion or landing accidents, but most of the aircrew survived. American combat search and rescue was as systematic and effective as American air defense. The Battle of the Philippine Sea ended Japanese hopes of defeating the American advance through naval aviation. Admiral Somu Toyota, commander of the combined fleet, had planned Operation Ago as the decisive battle that would stop American momentum. He believed concentrating Japan's remaining carrier strength could inflict enough damage to force negotiated peace. The plan assumed rough par in aircraft numbers and pilot quality. Both assumptions were false. American carriers outnumbered Japanese carriers. American pilots had vastly superior training, and American technology integrated into systematic procedures gave the United States an overwhelming advantage. Toyota's plan collapsed in a single day. The political consequences in Japan were immediate. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo resigned on July 18, less than a month after the Philippine Sea disaster. His government had promised victory. The Battle of the Philippine Sea proved victory was impossible. Tojo's resignation didn't change Japan's strategic situation. The war continued, but the resignation signaled to informed observers that Japanese leadership recognized the war was lost. The question became how long Japan would continue fighting and how much destruction would occur before surrender. For the United States, the Battle of the Philippine Sea confirmed that the island-hopping strategy would succeed. American forces secured Saipan by July 9th. Despite fierce Japanese resistance. Tinian fell on August 1st. Guam was recaptured by August 10th. The Marianas provided bases for B-29 Superfortress bombers. From Saipan and Tinian, American bombers could reach Tokyo. The strategic bombing campaign against Japan's home islands began in November 1944. The Marianas bases made that campaign possible, and American control of the Marianas was secured by the carrier battle that destroyed Japanese naval aviation on June 19th. The technological lessons of the Philippine Sea battle influenced naval warfare for decades. After World War II, every navy recognized that radar-directed fighter control was essential for carrier operations. The Soviet Union studied American CIC procedures and developed similar systems. The British Royal Navy, which had pioneered some radar techniques before the Americans, refined its own coordination procedures. NATO standardized air defense procedures based on American wartime experience. Modern carrier battle groups use digital systems that process information thousands of times faster than 1944 technology. But the fundamental concept remains identical. Detect threats at maximum range. Plot their position accurately. Vector interceptors to engage before threats reach defended ships. Coordinate all actions through centralized direction. The Combat Information Center of 1944 became the Combat Direction Center, and then the Combat Information Center again, as terminology evolved, but the functions stayed constant. The radar systems themselves evolved dramatically. The SK-2 radar used at Philippine Sea operated at 290 MHz with 100 kilowatts of power. Maximum range of 150 miles required ideal conditions. The system was remarkable for 1944, but primitive compared to modern standards. Post-war radar development produced systems operating at higher frequencies with vastly greater power and sensitivity. Digital signal processing replaced analog displays. Computer integration allowed automatic tracking of hundreds of targets simultaneously. The E-2 Hawkeye airborne early warning aircraft extended detection range to over 300 meters. The Aegis system could track and engage multiple threats simultaneously with minimal human intervention. But all these advances built on the foundation established when 1944 engineers figured out how to integrate radar detection with fighter direction. The human element remained critical even as technology advanced. Radar operators in 1944 watched circular screens and called out contacts manually. Modern systems display information on high-resolution color screens with computer assistance. But operators still must interpret data, recognize patterns, and make decisions under stress. Fighter directors in 1944 issued vectors by voice radio. Modern controllers use data links and digital communication, but they still must coordinate multiple aircraft, prioritize threats, and manage complex engagements in real time. The technology assists human decision-making. It doesn't replace it. That lesson from Philippine Sea remains valid today. The battle also demonstrated the importance of training and doctrine. American success came partly from superior equipment, but mostly from superior preparation. Fighter directors trained for months before deploying to combat. They practiced with radar operators and plotters until the team functioned smoothly under pressure. Standard procedures meant every CIC followed the same methods. A fighter director could transfer between ships and immediately understand the system. Hellcat pilots trained to follow vectors precisely, trusting that controllers were positioning them correctly. The trust between controllers and pilots developed through repeated training exercises. When combat came, everyone knew their role. The system functioned because hundreds of people had practiced their parts until coordination became automatic. Japanese forces never achieved that level of systematic preparation. Individual Japanese pilots trained intensively in flying skills. Japanese tactics emphasized small unit coordination between 2 or 3 aircraft, but large-scale coordination between carriers, between ships and aircraft, between multiple groups of fighters never developed systematically. Each ship operated independently. AC commander made individual decisions. When American radar-directed fighter control created a unified defense, Japanese forces couldn't respond effectively because they lacked the institutional structure to coordinate similar-scale responses. The broader lesson applied beyond naval warfare. Modern military operations in any domain require integration of technology, training, and doctrine into coherent systems. Individual weapons, no matter how advanced, provide limited advantage if not integrated into coordinated employment. Individual soldiers, no matter how skilled, cannot match the effectiveness of trained units using systematic procedures. The same principles that made combat information centers effective in 1944 apply to air operations, ground combat, cyber warfare, and space operations today. See the battlefield clearly, coordinate forces effectively, execute actions systematically. These principles transcend specific technologies and remain fundamental to military success. The memorial at Saipan honors the Marines and soldiers who fought ashore during June and July 1944. 29,000 American casualties, including 3,500 killed. The ground combat was brutal. Every cave, every ridge, every building had to be taken by infantry assault against fanatical resistance. The Battle of the Philippine Sea is less well-known than the ground fighting, but the carrier battle made the ground victory possible. If Japanese carrier aircraft had reached the invasion beaches, the assault forces would have